When the Crestview Hotel's windows began to show mysterious smears, no one knew exactly how they got there. The streaks appeared overnight, always in the same strange patterns, like faces pressed up against the glass. Guests complained about the marks, and no matter how hard the cleaning staff scrubbed, they couldn't get rid of them. Finally, the manager, Mr. Daniels, decided to hire a professional. Enter Henry, a window cleaner with decades of experience, who had worked at many hotels, but never one like Crestview. Henry arrived on a foggy morning, carrying his tools and ladders. The hotel had a grand facade, with tall windows that stretched up to the third floor. As he started his work on the windows of the first floor, he couldn't shake the odd feeling that something was off. At first, he thought it was just the damp, but the further he worked, the more uneasy he became. The smears on the glass didn't look like dirt or fingerprints. They looked like faces, their features distorted, their eyes wide with silent screams. As he cleaned the first window, Henry squinted, trying to get a closer look at one of the smudges. He froze. Behind the glass, in the empty room, he saw a face. It was pale and twisted, its mouth contorted in an unnatural shape. The eyes stared directly at him, unmoving. He stepped back quickly, heart pounding in his chest. But when he wiped the glass again, the face was gone. Shaking his head, he told himself it was just his imagination. The hotel had a lot of old windows, and they could play tricks on the eyes. He moved on to the next window, trying to push the unsettling feeling from his mind, but the next window wasn't much better. As Henry cleaned, he noticed another face, this one even clearer than the last, pressed against the glass. The face was older, with deep lines running down the cheeks, eyes wide and staring. The room behind the window was dark, its furniture covered in dust. Henry felt his stomach twist. He moved faster, cleaning the windows one by one, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread creeping over him. As he moved to the second floor, things only grew worse. The faces appeared in every window, each one more disturbing than the last. Some had mouths open in silent screams, others had eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved along. He thought he saw shadows moving in the rooms behind the glass, figures that never seemed to stay still. When he reached the top floor, things took a more sinister turn. He reached a window on the far side of the hall, one that looked out over the city. But when he looked through it, his breath caught in his throat. The room on the other side was completely empty, except for one thing. There was a figure standing in the middle of the room, facing him. Its shape was blurry, as if it wasn't entirely solid. Its head tilted to one side, and Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He stepped back, heart racing. The figure didn't move, but Henry felt its presence, cold and watching. He wiped the glass again, but the figure didn't disappear. It was still there, and now it seemed closer, as if it had moved closer to the window. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from inside the room. Henry jumped, his pulse quickening. He quickly turned and rushed back down the hall toward the elevator. His hands shook as he grabbed the buttons, desperate to escape the oppressive air of the hotel. But when he turned to glance over his shoulder, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood at the end of the hallway, watching him with empty eyes. It didn't move, but Henry knew it was there. As he stepped into the elevator, the doors slammed shut. He glanced up, expecting to see the usual floor numbers, but instead, they were all blank. The elevator moved slowly, descending, but no matter how many floors it passed, it never reached the ground. Suddenly, the elevator stopped, and the doors opened. The hallway in front of him was dark and unfamiliar. A chill filled the air, and Henry felt the oppressive weight of the hotel pressing down on him. A voice, barely a whisper, filled the air. "You're not finished, Henry." The elevator doors slammed shut again, and Henry was left standing in the hallway. He turned, only to see the figure from the window standing at the end of the hall. Its face was no longer blurred, it was clear now, twisted and contorted in a grotesque smile. He took a step back, but the figure moved closer. Slowly, painfully, it dragged itself forward, its eyes never leaving him. Henry's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move, and as the figure drew closer, Henry realized the truth. The faces on the windows hadn't been trying to get his attention, they had been warning him. And now, he was part of the hotel. The last thing Henry heard before the darkness swallowed him was the faint whisper of the voice again. "Welcome to the hotel, Henry. You'll never leave." Jake had always been a solitary man, one who found peace in the vastness of the desert. The open expanse, the quiet stillness, and the starry skies at night gave him a sense of freedom that no city or crowded street could provide. His idea of a perfect vacation was to pitch a tent miles away from civilization, surrounded only by the howling winds and the occasional call of a distant coyote. This time, he'd chosen a remote spot in the Arizona desert, far from any marked trails, drawn by the lure of true isolation. The first night, Jake set up camp without incident. The fire crackled, and he could hear the distant hum of the wind shifting the sand. As the night wore on, he lay back on his sleeping bag, watching the stars twinkle overhead. He was alone in the desert, at peace, or so he thought. Around midnight, Jake's phone buzzed. It wasn't unusual, sometimes he would get a weak signal even in the most remote places. But when he glanced at the screen, he froze. The caller ID was unknown, just a series of random numbers. He hesitated but picked up the phone anyway, curious and maybe a little annoyed that anyone would be calling him out here. "Hello?" Jake said, his voice rough from the dry air. There was nothing but silence on the other end. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl, as though the phone had been disconnected. He waited a few moments before hanging up. Maybe it was a glitch, a dropped call, or someone playing a prank. He dismissed it and set the phone back down next to him. But that wasn't the end of it. The next night, as Jake sat by the fire, the phone rang again, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. He answered it, half expecting more silence, but this time, there was a faint static noise before the line went dead. "Who's there?" Jake called out into the emptiness. No response. The night after that, the phone rang again. By now, Jake was beginning to feel a strange unease. The phone call, though silent, was persistent, ringing at the same time each night, always from that same untraceable number. His curiosity got the better of him. He decided to start documenting the strange occurrences. Each night, as the phone rang, Jake would answer and listen for any sign of life, but the silence was always deafening. The static, the dead air, it gnawed at him, pulling him into a sense of unease he couldn't shake. But that was the worst part. The calls were always there, at midnight, like clockwork, no matter where he went or how deep into the desert he traveled. After a few days, something else started to happen. Jake began noticing odd patterns in the sand around his camp. Each morning, after the night's call, strange symbols appeared, etched into the sand, as though something, or someone, had been moving in the darkness, carving these markings in the night. At first, he thought it was just the wind, shifting the sand into patterns. But these symbols were too precise, too deliberate to be random. They resembled ancient runes, the kind Jake had seen in old books about forgotten languages and lost civilizations. Some were circular, some jagged, but they all seemed to pull at him, each one more intricate than the last. As the calls grew more frequent, Jake's sleep became erratic. His thoughts, once clear, began to cloud over, and he started seeing things in the corners of his eyes. Shadows darting just out of reach, figures standing motionless in the distance, only to disappear when he looked directly at them. It was as if the desert was slowly closing in around him, swallowing him whole. One night, after the call ended in the usual silence, Jake grabbed his flashlight and headed out of his tent, determined to investigate the strange symbols in the sand. As he knelt down to study one of the larger patterns, he felt a chill ripple through the air. The temperature had dropped suddenly, as though something had shifted in the atmosphere. He ran his fingers over the sand, tracing the edges of the symbols, when his flashlight flickered. The beam landed on something else, a new symbol, larger and more complex, etched into the sand beneath his feet. It wasn't there the night before. His heart pounded as he realized the symbols were changing, evolving each night as though they were responding to his presence. Just then, the phone rang again. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He had been expecting it, but now, with the eerie markings around him and the cold sensation crawling up his spine, he felt trapped. The number was still untraceable, but this time, when he picked it up, something was different. This time, there was a voice, but it wasn't a voice he recognized. It was distorted, warped by static, and spoke in fragmented phrases, like a broken record. "You are lost. Find the exit." Jake's mind raced. The words didn't make sense. Exit? He was out in the middle of the desert, miles from the nearest town. What exit could they be talking about? "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fear. There was a pause, then the voice returned, clearer this time, but still fractured. "You can't leave, trapped. Forever." Before Jake could respond, the call abruptly ended, leaving him alone in the desert, heart pounding, with only the wind as company. The next day, Jake packed up his things and decided to leave. He couldn't stand the feeling of being watched, the way the symbols were slowly creeping closer to his camp, the calls that seemed to echo in his mind even when his phone was off. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that if he didn't leave now, he would never leave at all. As he loaded his gear into his truck, he noticed something else. The symbols in the sand were gone. The desert floor was smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. He felt a brief flash of relief, but it quickly faded as he turned his back to the camp. That night, as he drove away, the phone rang once more. He slammed his hand on the steering wheel, but the phone continued to ring. The voice, now distorted and echoing, came through. "You never escape." Jake's hands shook as he answered. The voice spoke again, but this time, the words were clear. "You're already here." The line went dead. For weeks, Jake tried to forget the calls, the symbols, and the feeling that something was following him, watching him. He couldn't explain what happened out there in the desert, but the calls stopped. Or so he thought. Then, one night, while lying in bed, his phone rang. It was the same untraceable number. And the voice, cold and clear, spoke one final time. "You're still in the desert." Jake didn't recognize the voice, but he knew he was never going to leave. The last phone call had been made. And Jake was already lost in time. When Clara Hayes arrived in the sleepy town of Ravenswood, she thought she had found the perfect retreat. The streets were lined with cobblestone, the houses quaint with flower boxes in every window, and the forest that hugged the town brimmed with a quiet, untouched beauty. But it was the cemetery at the edge of town that truly caught her eye. Old and sprawling, the cemetery was surrounded by an iron gate cloaked in ivy. Clara often passed it on her evening walks, drawn to the serene stillness within. But the locals warned her to stay away after dark. Strange things happen there, the grocer muttered one day. Clara brushed it off as small-town superstition, but curiosity gnawed at her. One moonlit night, unable to sleep, Clara grabbed her notebook and ventured to the cemetery. The air was cool and still, and the gravestones, weathered and cracked, seemed to glow under the moonlight. She wandered among them, jotting down descriptions, when a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a whisper, soft and fleeting, like the rustle of leaves. Clara turned, her pulse quickening. She saw no one. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an eerie chorus. She crouched beside a moss-covered tombstone and pressed her ear close. "They took me in the dead of night," a voice murmured. Clara gasped and stumbled back. The whisper was unmistakable, coming from the grave itself. Another tombstone whispered, its voice sharp and accusing. "Lies were my downfall." She moved from stone to stone, each one telling a piece of a dark puzzle. The voices spoke of betrayal, greed, and unspeakable acts committed in the shadows of Ravenswood. One voice, softer than the rest, said, "They'll come for you too." Chills ran down Clara's spine. Who's coming?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But the tombstones fell silent, the air heavy with unspoken dread. Clara rushed home, her mind racing. She pored over her notes, trying to make sense of the cryptic whispers. A pattern began to emerge, a history of townspeople disappearing under mysterious circumstances, their deaths hidden and unacknowledged. The next day, Clara visited the town archives. She discovered records of fires, accidents, and unexplained vanishings spanning decades. The victims all shared one trait: they had uncovered secrets about Ravenswood. The pieces clicked into place. The cemetery's whispers weren't just the echoes of the dead, they were warnings. The town had a dark history, and its whispers cried out for justice. But someone, or something, didn't want the truth to come out. That night, Clara locked her doors and windows, her unease growing. As midnight approached, the whispers returned, not from the cemetery but from outside her house. Faint, indistinct murmurs floated through the air, growing louder and closer. Clara's heart pounded as she peered through the curtains. Shadows flickered under the street lamp, figures moving silently toward her home. She backed away, clutching her notebook. Then came the knock. Soft, deliberate. "Clara," a voice called, eerily calm. "We know what you've been hearing. Let us in. We just want to talk." She pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. The whispers had warned her, but now she realized too late, she was next. Gathering her courage, she grabbed her notes and slipped out the back door. The forest loomed ahead, dark and full of promise. If she could make it to the highway, she might escape. The whispers followed her, urging her on. "Run," they pleaded. "Run while you can." As Clara disappeared into the trees, the figures at her door melted back into the shadows, their secret safe for now. But the tombstones whispered on, their truths waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to listen. It was a foggy Friday evening when reporter Sophie Walker first heard the rumors. Commuters were talking about a ghostly train, one that appeared late at night on a stretch of track long thought to be abandoned. Sophie, always chasing a good story, felt a chill run down her spine. She'd heard the tales before, but tonight something in the voices of the people she interviewed made her believe there was more to it than a simple urban legend. The train was said to appear without warning, a pale shadow emerging from the mist. Its headlights never flickered, and the sound of its wheels never seemed to touch the ground. Some claimed they'd seen the passengers inside, faces frozen in eerie stillness, eyes vacant, as if they were waiting for something that would never come. Sophie decided to investigate. She wasn't one to shy away from the supernatural, though she'd never experienced anything firsthand. She made her way to the old train station on the outskirts of town, where the tracks leading into the forest were said to hold secrets too dark for daylight. The station was dilapidated, covered in vines and rust, with a sign that hadn't been touched in decades. No one had used the line in years, at least, that was what she'd been told. At midnight, she stood at the edge of the tracks, her camera ready, her senses alert. The air was thick with the scent of rain, but the fog seemed to grow denser, swirling around her feet like it had a life of its own. The town was silent, not a single light visible for miles. Suddenly, Sophie heard the faintest sound, the soft whistle of a train, distant at first but growing closer with every passing second. She looked down the tracks and saw it, a spectral glow in the distance, creeping through the fog. Her heart raced. It was the train, the phantom train. As it drew nearer, Sophie felt her pulse quicken. The train didn't sound like any train she had ever heard. There were no clanging wheels or the screech of metal on metal. It was as if the train glided over the tracks, its eerie whistle the only sound that broke the silence. Sophie took a few steps closer, her camera poised, but she couldn't bring herself to take a picture. There was something about the train that made her hesitate. It passed by her with unnatural slowness, its light casting long shadows across the ground. Sophie saw it clearly now. There were people inside. Pale, motionless figures sat by the windows, their eyes vacant, staring out into nothingness. Some were wearing clothes from decades ago, outdated suits, old-fashioned dresses, and hats that hadn't been seen in years. The figures didn't move, didn't blink, and didn't even seem to acknowledge her presence. It was as if they were frozen in time, stuck in a moment they couldn't escape. Sophie's mind raced. Who were they? Why were they there? And why couldn't she take a single photograph? The train passed completely, and for a moment, Sophie stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. The silence returned to the station, but the air felt thicker now, heavy with an unspoken dread. But before she could turn to leave, she heard a voice. A whisper, soft and chilling, drifting toward her from the train. "Help us." Sophie spun around, but the train was gone. The tracks lay still and empty, bathed in the fog's sickly glow. Her heart hammered in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the train's presence or the whisper that had left her shaken to the core. Compelled to know more, Sophie dove into the history of the old track the next day. She dug through archives, visited the local library, and spoke with elderly residents who had lived in the area for decades. What she uncovered was more unsettling than she could have imagined. The train was not a ghost, nor a figment of imagination. It had once been part of the town's commuter system, running regularly up until the early 1940s, when a terrible accident occurred on this very stretch of track. A passenger train had collided with a freight train in thick fog, and dozens had died. The incident was swept under the rug, officially declared an accident with no further investigation. But the locals knew better. They spoke of a curse that had followed the survivors, and how every year, on the anniversary of the crash, the train would reappear to claim more souls. No one had ever truly understood why, but it was said that the souls of the passengers never left the train. They were trapped in that moment, bound by the accident, and the train had become a vessel for their spirits. That night, Sophie returned to the tracks, heart pounding with the weight of what she had learned. As midnight struck again, she waited, her camera in hand. The train appeared, just as before, its light cutting through the fog. This time, Sophie wasn't afraid. She approached the train, her footsteps steady despite the cold dread creeping up her spine. She reached for the door, but before she could touch it, the figures inside stirred. One woman's face came into focus, her eyes wide and filled with desperation. The woman mouthed words, her lips trembling. "Help us," she pleaded again, her voice echoing in Sophie's mind. Suddenly, Sophie realized the truth. The passengers weren't dead, they were trapped, caught in an endless loop of time. The train wasn't merely a ghost, it was a prison. And Sophie was the key. The train began to move again, slowly, creeping back into the fog. Sophie stood frozen, staring at the fading lights, the echo of that haunting whisper still ringing in her ears. She had uncovered the secret. But some mysteries, it seemed, were not meant to be solved. It was the first weekend of October when a group of friends, Laura, Ben, Katie, and Mark, decided to attend the Harvest Moon Festival at the edge of a small rural town. It was the kind of festival that promised haunted hayrides, pumpkin carving contests, and corn mazes stretching as far as the eye could see. They were all excited, eager to embrace the spooky season and make new memories before the chill of winter set in. As they arrived at the entrance to the festival, the scent of caramel apples and fresh kettle corn filled the air. The streets were lined with booths, and people in costumes roamed about, laughter and chatter bouncing off the festive tents. But it was the flyer they saw at the entrance that caught their attention. World's largest corn maze, $5 for entry. Dare to find your way out? Mark, ever the daredevil, grinned. "We should totally do it," he said, holding up the flyer. "It'll be fun. How hard can it be?" Laura hesitated. She'd heard rumors about the maze. People said it was designed by a local farmer who took Halloween very seriously, but there were whispers about it being more than just a festive attraction. Some claimed the maze had a dark history, a place where people sometimes got lost for days, only to emerge changed. But those were just stories, right? "I don't know," Laura muttered, glancing at the sprawling fields in the distance, the towering stalks of corn rising like walls in the twilight. "It's getting late. Maybe we should stick to something a little less creepy." But the group was already moving toward the entrance. Ben, Katie, and Mark were in high spirits, laughing as they shoved each other playfully. Despite her growing unease, Laura reluctantly followed. The maze was much larger than she had expected. As they entered, the path ahead was a series of narrow, twisting turns, the corn stretching far above them, blocking out much of the fading light. The scent of the corn was overpowering, earthy and damp, as if the soil itself was breathing. The group walked in a loose line, Ben leading the way, his voice calling out occasionally to the others, daring them to keep up. Hours passed, or at least, that's what it felt like. The light from the festival behind them seemed to fade into the distance, swallowed by the maze. It wasn't long before the group realized that the exits they thought they had passed earlier weren't appearing again. Every turn they took seemed to lead them deeper into the labyrinth, the corn stalks twisting in ways that didn't make sense. "I swear we've been here before," Katie said, her voice edged with frustration. That same turn, that same split in the path. We're going in circles. Mark, always the optimist, laughed it off. It's just the maze. It's supposed to mess with your head. But as they continued on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air grew colder, and the cheerful sounds of the festival, music, laughter, the distant hum of a carnival ride, were completely gone. In their place, there was an eerie silence, thick and unsettling. "Okay, something's wrong," Laura said, stopping dead in her tracks. "We've been walking for hours, and there's no sign of the exit." Ben's face was pale. "We're just overthinking it," he muttered, his voice tense. "Let's keep moving. We'll find our way out." But as they pressed on, the corn seemed to close in around them, the stalks bending unnaturally toward the group. It was as if the maze itself was alive, aware of their every move. Then, it happened. A chilling scream echoed from somewhere deep in the maze. It was long and drawn out, filled with terror. The friends froze. "Did you hear that?" Katie whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. He was already stepping forward, his eyes wide with fear. That sounded like someone else is in here," he said. The group moved forward cautiously, trying to follow the direction of the scream, but the sound faded quickly, replaced by an unnatural quiet. As they walked deeper, the air grew colder, and they could hear faint whispers drifting through the maze. The voices were unintelligible, but the urgency in their tone was unmistakable. And then, the figures appeared. At first, they were just shadows at the edges of their vision, figures standing still, almost statuesque, in the distance. As the group got closer, they could make out the shapes more clearly, pale, gaunt figures draped in ragged clothing. They stood motionless, their heads tilted at odd angles, eyes wide open but unfocused. Some of the figures had their arms outstretched as if reaching for something, perhaps the group, perhaps something else. "Who are they?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Laura said, her stomach twisting in knots. "Let's keep moving." But the figures didn't move. They simply stood there, watching, waiting. And the deeper they went into the maze, the more figures they saw, each one eerier than the last, their twisted expressions sending shivers down their spines. The more the group tried to avoid them, the closer the figures seemed to get. They were always at the edges of the path, never in their direct line of sight, but constantly there, watching. Always watching. And then came the second scream. This one was different. It was loud, high-pitched, and painfully real. It sounded as if it were right beside them. The friends spun around, but there was nothing. No one. I can't take it anymore," Katie cried, her voice panicked. "We need to get out of here. This place isn't right." But as they turned around to retrace their steps, the path had changed. The maze had shifted. What was once a clear way back to the entrance was now an impenetrable wall of corn, the stalks pressed tightly together, closing off any route they had previously taken. That wasn't there before. Mark shouted, his eyes wild. "This isn't a game anymore." They ran, desperation taking over. The labyrinth seemed to grow ever more convoluted, twisting and turning in impossible directions. The air became thick, stifling, as if the very atmosphere was pressing in on them. And all the while, the whispers grew louder, the figures moved closer, and the cries of anguish echoed around them. Then, it happened again. The maze shifted. The ground beneath them trembled, and the stalks of corn closed in from all sides, trapping them in an impossible web of twisted paths. No matter which way they turned, the exit was always farther out of reach. The figures were everywhere now, surrounding them, their cold eyes fixed on the group. Suddenly, they realized this was not just a maze. This was something darker. The maze had become a prison, one that fed off their fear, trapping them in an endless loop of torment. The last thing they heard before the light of the festival was swallowed entirely by the darkness was the sound of the figures moving, their footsteps in perfect unison with their own. And the last scream they heard was not from the maze, it was their own, echoed back at them, lost forever in the labyrinth's grip. And still, every year, when the Harvest Moon Festival rolls around, the maze opens once again, waiting for new victims, pulling them deeper into its twisted corridors. Those who enter never return, not in body, at least. But their voices, their cries, can still be heard, echoing across the fields, forever lost in the midnight maze.